In November of 2005, my family took a trip to a remote cabin deep in the mountains of Montana, near the edge of the Glacier National Park. The cabin was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by a dense forest of pine and spruce that seemed to close in tighter as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The chill of late autumn clung to the air, and snow blanketed the ground, muffling every sound except the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. The cabin was quaint but eerie, with a simple wooden structure, dim lighting, and a lingering scent of aged wood and smoke. It was as if the place had been frozen in time, untouched by the world beyond the trees. My dad, always one to embrace the rustic outdoors, was excited for a weekend away from city life, but even he seemed to be breathing a bit heavier than usual, reaching for the portable oxygen tank he'd brought along for the high altitude. The cabin had an unusual layout, with a narrow staircase leading up to a loft where two small twin beds were set under a low ceiling. My sister Chloe and I would sleep up there, while my youngest sister Lizzie, only a toddler, would stay downstairs with Dad. As we settled in that first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching us, that somehow every creak of the wooden floorboards was a whisper from the past. The night began innocently enough. My mom made us hot cocoa, and we roasted marshmallows by the fire, the warmth from the flames casting a soft, flickering glow across the room. Outside, the forest was dark and silent, an ocean of shadows stretching endlessly into the night. We laughed and told stories, but as the evening wore on, a strange tension settled over me, an unexplainable sense of dread that I couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling that makes you constantly look over your shoulder, even when you know no one's there. Finally, we climbed up to the loft and settled into our beds. The darkness seemed heavier up there, pressing down on us like a thick blanket. Chloe was asleep in minutes, her soft breaths a small comfort against the silence. I lay there, staring up at the wooden beams above, trying to force myself to relax. But something didn't feel right. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, pooling around the corners of the loft like ink, and the silence was so absolute it felt unnatural. Then, in the stillness, I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping, like nails scratching against the wooden floor. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and distinct, breaking through the silence with an eerie regularity. My breath caught in my throat as I lay there, frozen, listening to the sound grow closer. It wasn't the kind of tapping you'd expect from an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow, almost like footsteps. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake Chloe. For a moment, I thought about calling out for my dad, but fear kept me rooted in place. I was terrified that if I made a sound, whatever was causing that noise would know I was awake. Through the small gap between my pillow and the edge of the bed, I dared to peek out, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. And then I saw it, a hand, dark and shadowy, with fingers longer and thinner than they should have been, reaching up over the edge of the loft railing. Each finger ended in a sharp, pointed tip, tapping lightly against the wood as it slowly, deliberately dragged itself into view. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just my imagination. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, like it was trying to get my attention. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, to wake my dad, to do anything but lie there paralyzed with fear. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I stayed like that, with my eyes squeezed shut and my body frozen in terror. Eventually, the tapping faded, replaced by an unnatural silence that seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. Slowly, I dared to open my eyes, and to my relief, the hand was gone. But the fear lingered, settling deep into my bones. The next morning, the sunlight felt like a blessing, chasing away the shadows that had haunted the night. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind. But as we explored the cabin, I noticed something strange near my bed. A small, wooden door set into the wall, barely visible behind an old nightstand. It was no bigger than a shoebox with a rusty handle and hinges that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I called my dad over, and he pried the door open, revealing a tiny compartment filled with dust and cobwebs. Inside, there were a few old jars of preserved food and some cans of water. The sight of it was strangely unsettling, like it was a secret that had been buried long ago, hidden behind layers of dust and silence. That night, as darkness fell, I felt the familiar weight of fear settle over me once again. My dad started a fire in the fireplace, and its warm glow filled the room, casting long shadows up to the loft. I told myself it would be fine. The tapping was just a bad dream, a product of my overactive imagination. But as the night wore on and the fire died down, the shadows began to creep in again, slowly filling the room with a suffocating darkness. I lay in bed, staring at the tiny door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. Then, just as my eyes were beginning to droop, the tapping returned. It was louder this time, more deliberate, echoing through the silence like a dark, rhythmic chant. My heart stopped as I realized it was coming from behind the tiny door, muffled but persistent, as if something was trapped inside, scratching and clawing, desperate to get out. I pulled the blanket over my head, clutching it tightly as the tapping grew louder and more frantic. I could hear each scrape of nails against the wood, each hollow thud as something pounded against the door, trying to break free. I whispered a prayer under my breath, hoping it would go away, that it was all just in my mind. But then the door shook, rattling against the hinges, and I could feel a cold breeze seep through the cracks, chilling my skin. I pressed myself against the wall, too terrified to move as the door continued to rattle and shake. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt almost alive. I lay there, my heart racing, listening for any sign of movement. But the door remained closed, the tiny room beyond it shrouded in darkness. The next morning, I was too afraid to mention it to anyone. I forced myself to smile and laugh, pretending everything was fine. But as we packed up and left the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next family to stumble upon its secret. Even now, years later, I can still hear that tapping in my mind, like a faint, haunting echo that refuses to fade. Every time I close my eyes, I see that hand, those long, twisted fingers reaching out from the darkness, tapping, waiting. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that cabin is still there, waiting for someone to open the door once again. The summer of 2013 was supposed to be a simple escape from the hustle of city life. My family and I rented a small cabin deep in the Idaho mountains near the Clearwater National Forest. The cabin was nestled among towering pine trees, each one seemingly more ancient and ominous than the last. It was the type of place where silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, as if the trees were holding their breath, watching our every move. The cabin itself was rustic, built from rough timber and stone, its windows small and shuttered against the world outside. There was something haunting about it, a sense of isolation that clung to the walls. Our first night passed uneventfully, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination casting strange shadows. My younger sister Ellie, who was only 11, shared a room with me, while my parents took the larger bedroom at the end of the hall. On the second night, just as the sun was setting, my dad stepped out to gather firewood from the forest's edge. As he disappeared into the shadows, an unsettling thought crossed my mind. The trees seemed to swallow him, their branches reaching down like twisted skeletal fingers. When he returned, his face was pale, and he had a strange, haunted look in his eyes. But when my mom asked if something was wrong, he brushed it off, saying he was just tired. After dinner, we sat in the living room, the fire crackling and filling the cabin with a warm glow. But beyond the windows, the world was pitch black, an endless void broken only by the faint outlines of the pines. I tried to distract myself with a book, but every so often I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, like something darting between the trees. My mom must have noticed too, because she kept glancing over her shoulder, her expression tense. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I headed to the small bedroom I shared with Ellie, hoping to escape the strange tension hanging in the air. As I settled into bed, I noticed the curtains were slightly open, and I could see the pines swaying in the wind, their branches casting long, thin shadows that seemed to creep across the floor. I reached over to close the curtains, but stopped when I noticed Ellie was already asleep. Her face looked serene, yet vacant, as if she wasn't really there. Just as I was about to turn away, a low, distant howl cut through the silence. It didn't sound like a coyote or any animal I'd heard before. It was too long, too drawn out, echoing through the trees like a mournful wail. My stomach twisted as I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. The howling grew louder, closer, each cry filled with an emptiness that made my skin crawl. I glanced over at Ellie's bed, hoping she would wake up, but she was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the howl wasn't coming from an animal at all. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to sleep, but the sound lingered, wrapping around the cabin like a heavy fog, pressing in from all sides. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to find Ellie standing by the window, her back to me. She was staring out into the darkness, her posture rigid, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. I called her name softly, but she didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Her gaze was fixed on something beyond the trees, something only she could see. I slipped out of bed and approached her, my heart pounding. Her face was expressionless, her eyes wide and empty. I gently touched her shoulder, but she didn't react, as if she were in a trance. Following her gaze, I peered out into the darkness, but all I could see were the endless rows of trees, silent and unmoving. Then, as if sensing my presence, Ellie slowly turned to look at me. Her eyes were dull, unfocused, as if she were somewhere far away. She didn't speak, just stared at me with a blank expression that sent a shiver down my spine. Without a word, she turned and climbed back into bed, falling asleep as if nothing had happened. I lay awake for hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, my sleep haunted by strange, twisted images of shadows moving among the trees, of faces lurking just beyond the edge of the forest. The next day, Ellie didn't remember anything about the night before. She seemed her usual self, laughing and chatting with our parents as if nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that whatever had stared out from her eyes wasn't really my sister. My parents didn't seem to notice, brushing off my concerns with a laugh and telling me I was just tired. That evening, as the sun set, we locked all the doors and closed the curtains, hoping to block out the darkness pressing in from outside. But as the shadows deepened, the sense of unease grew stronger. wrapping around us like a cold, invisible fog. Around midnight, the howling started again, louder and closer than before. It was a horrible, guttural sound, filled with a rage that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding, as the howling grew closer, each cry more desperate, more wild. I glanced over at Ellie, but she was gone. Panic gripped me as I scanned the room, finally spotting her standing by the door, her hand resting on the doorknob as if she were about to open it. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the door. Her skin was ice cold, and when she looked at me, her expression was blank, unseeing. It was as if she didn't even recognize me. I dragged her back to bed, holding her hand tightly, whispering reassurances, even though I wasn't sure who I was comforting, her or myself. The howling continued outside, circling the cabin, each cry echoing through the night. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up just as dawn was breaking, the world outside bathed in an eerie gray light. Ellie was sleeping soundly beside me, her face calm and peaceful, but the memory of her blank stare haunted me, a dark shadow lingering at the edge of my thoughts. We spent the rest of the day on edge, my parents chalking up our unease to nerves or lack of sleep. They suggested we go for a hike, hoping the fresh air would calm us down. But as we walked through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed louder, more ominous. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking among the trees. That night, the howling returned, even louder than before. It was joined by strange whispers, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. I lay in bed, clutching the blanket, feeling the walls of the cabin close in around me. Then, just as the whispers reached a fever pitch, the door to our room slowly creaked open. My breath caught as I stared into the dark hallway, my mind racing with fear. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but the sound died in my throat. I felt Ellie stir beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. Together we watched as a shadow passed by our door, its shape distorted and twisted, like something not quite human. The figure paused outside our room, and I could feel its presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on us. I squeezed Ellie's hand, barely daring to breathe as it slowly turned, its face obscured by the shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw eyes gleaming in the darkness, staring directly at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow moved on, fading into the darkness. The howling ceased, leaving only the silence, thick and oppressive. We lay there, motionless, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn finally broke through the windows. When morning came, we packed our things in a hurry, eager to leave the cabin and the horrors that lurked in its shadows. My parents were pale and quiet, their faces drawn with exhaustion. None of us spoke as we climbed into the car, the memory of that dark figure lingering in our minds. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time, half expecting to see it standing by the edge of the trees, watching us go. And for a brief moment, I thought I did. A shadowy figure, just barely visible, its eyes glinting in the early morning light. To this day, I can still hear that howl echoing in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that waited for us in those woods. It was late autumn when my family and I drove up to the Smoky Mountains for a much-anticipated vacation. We rented a small lodge near Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a place that sat at the edge of the dense, mysterious Smoky Pines forest. My parents had been talking about this getaway for months, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The lodge was perched on the edge of the forest, shrouded in shadows cast by the towering pines. It had a rustic charm, with wooden walls, thick beams, and a large stone fireplace in the main room. But despite the cozy fire and warm lighting, the cabin had an unsettling feel, as if it were hiding secrets in every dark corner. My two younger sisters, Emma and Madison, were excited, running through the rooms and planning out who would sleep where. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the strange sense that we were being watched. We spent the first few days hiking and exploring, trying to enjoy the fresh air and the quiet isolation. But on our third day, we went to the pool at a nearby resort, hoping to relax and take our minds off the eerie atmosphere that had been gnawing at me since we'd arrived. As we swam, I became aware of a man lingering near the edge of the pool. He wore tight goggles that pressed hard against his skin, leaving deep red imprints around his eyes. He stared at us, his gaze steady and unblinking, with a faint, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that he was just some eccentric guest. But as we swam, I noticed he was slowly drifting closer, inching toward us with each stroke. My mom must have noticed too, because she quietly gestured for us to get out of the pool. We dried off quickly, casting nervous glances back at the man as we gathered our things. My dad had already left to get the car, so it was just my mom, my sisters, and me. In the changing rooms, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I had the strange sensation that we were not alone. I quickly dressed, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I reached for my bag, I caught a glimpse of the man's reflection in the mirror. He was standing in the doorway, his head tilted slightly, watching me with an intense, unsettling gaze. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, rooted in place by the cold dread that washed over me. When I turned around, he was gone, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps down the hall. Back outside, my younger sister Emma needed to use the restroom, so my mom took her to a different restroom across the pool. Just as they walked away, I spotted the man again, standing by the entrance to the restroom, his gaze fixed intently on my mom and sister. He was too close, and his smile had turned into something dark and twisted, his eyes glinting with something that sent shivers through me. My mom saw him too, and quickly steered Emma away, guiding her to another bathroom. I followed closely, feeling as though I were being drawn into a nightmare. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that he was just some eccentric guest. But as we swam, I noticed he was slowly drifting closer, inching toward us with each stroke. My mom must have noticed too, because she quietly gestured for us to get out of the pool. We dried off quickly, casting nervous glances back at the man as we gathered our things. My dad had already left to get the car, so it was just my mom, my sisters, and me. In the changing rooms, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I had the strange sensation that we were not alone. I quickly dressed, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I reached for my bag, I caught a glimpse of the man's reflection in the mirror. He was standing in the doorway, his head tilted slightly, watching me with an intense, unsettling gaze. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, rooted in place by the cold dread that washed over me. When I turned around, he was gone, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps down the hall. Back outside, my younger sister Emma needed to use the restroom, so my mom took her to a different restroom across the pool. Just as they walked away, I spotted the man again, standing by the entrance to the restroom, his gaze fixed intently on my mom and sister. He was too close, and his smile had turned into something dark and twisted, his eyes glinting with something that sent shivers through me. My mom saw him too, and quickly steered Emma away, guiding her to another bathroom. I followed closely, feeling as though I were being drawn into a nightmare. The encounter left us all shaken, but we tried to brush it off as we made our way back to the lodge. That evening, we sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. My sisters were playing a board game, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, his expression so twisted and unnatural, his eyes so dark. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the old wood, made me jump, as if I were waiting for something to appear in the shadows. As night fell, the forest outside grew darker, an inky blackness that seemed to press up against the windows, swallowing all light. I couldn't sleep, so I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the forest outside. The wind rustled through the trees, and every so often, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. But each time I looked out the window, there was nothing there but shadows. Just after midnight, a loud knock echoed through the lodge, followed by a slow, rhythmic tapping on the window. I sat up, my heart pounding, as the tapping continued, each knock sharper and more deliberate. I glanced over at my sister, Madison, who had come into my room earlier, too afraid to sleep on her own. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, and together we crept to the window. That evening, as the sun began to set, my dad double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows. We gathered in the living room, trying to ignore the growing darkness outside. But as night fell, an oppressive silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire. We tried to play board games to distract ourselves, but every sound, every flicker of shadow made us jump. Around 2 a.m., a loud, heavy knock rattled the front door, followed by another and another. My dad went to the window, peering out into the darkness, but he couldn't see anyone. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence like a heartbeat. I held my breath, feeling my heart race as the knocks grew louder, each one shaking the door on its hinges. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, almost alive. We stayed frozen in place, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Slowly, we began to relax, convincing ourselves it was just our nerves playing tricks on us. But then, from the other side of the cabin, we heard a scratching sound, soft at first like nails scraping against the wood. It grew louder, moving from one window to the next, as if something or someone was circling the lodge, searching for a way inside. My sisters clutched each other, their faces pale with fear, as the scratching grew more frantic, more desperate. My dad grabbed a flashlight, shining it through the windows, but all we saw was darkness, an endless void broken only by the faint shapes of trees swaying in the wind. He locked the doors again, double-checking every latch, but the scratching continued, each scrape sending chills down my spine. Finally, just before dawn, the scratching stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. We huddled together, waiting for the first light of day to chase away the shadows that had haunted us through the night. When the sun finally rose, we packed our things in a hurry, too scared to stay a moment longer. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see a face staring back at me from one of the windows. And for a brief moment, I thought I did. A pale face, with dark, empty eyes, watching us as we drove away, disappearing into the shadows as the trees swallowed the cabin once again. To this day, I can still hear the sound of those footsteps, the slow, deliberate knocking, the scratching that seemed to follow us from room to room. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees at night, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next family to stumble into their dark, silent domain.